My name is Doug Kaminsky. I'm your moderator for the closing remarks. This is going to be probably an interesting thing. It's almost an experiment for Dr. Kelly, for the folks that put on this conference, because we're going to talk about the conscious, the responsibility side of big data. So all day you've been learning all these wonderful things you can do, the exciting things, these kind of groundbreaking applications you can use in big data. We're going to give you the sober part of it. Some people almost said that, you know, we're going to be your buzzkill, but we're going to try not to do that. What we're going to try to do is show you how companies, as well as others that use big data, are having to pay attention to how that data is used, how it's collected, how it's distributed, what we do with that data, because it is a living thing as well. And there are certain responsibilities that go with it. So I assembled probably one of the best panels you could find on the subject. I'm going to have each one of them introduce themselves, but I have folks from law firms, from corporations, and some that have past history with the Defense Department. So you're going to get a lot of perspectives on how data is used and misused. Two things, we'll take questions towards the end, so think of those questions as we go through. We'll try to direct those at that point. And then, of course, we're the ones in between you and the alcohol and the hors d'oeuvres. So,
and the Kentucky Derby.
And the Kentucky Derby. So we want to make sure those are good questions, but we will end on time so we don't get in the way of you. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Duke Alden to introduce himself, say a few words, and then we'll get rolling.
Hey, good evening. Can I say that yet? Almost. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Duke Alden. I am on my way to a derby party, so I don't always dress like this. I'm here in Chicago. I am the Chief Information Security Officer at Aon Corporation, so just down the street. I have an interesting sort of career history. I'm a lawyer who always sort of had a bit of a technology bent, and I consulted in the e-discovery and information governance space for years, and joined Aon as their director, vice president of information governance. That role morphed into a data protection role, and I now serve as CISO.
Yeah, you can lie, dude. It's awesome. You just have to, oh, you know what? I think I'm on my, I got one. You just have to applaud his pants, right?
We'll auction them off.
I'm Jill Rhodes. This was a pen that doesn't work, but thank you. I am the CISO, Vice President CISO of a company called Option Care. We're a healthcare-based company. I literally started that job on Monday. I left the job as the CISO, Vice President and CISO of an insurance company, and both of those are in the North Shore of Chicago. I actually come from the intelligence community. I spent most of my career in the national security world, in the intel community. My last job in the intel community was building the intelligence community cloud environment. I was in charge of integrating data and security. I'm also a lawyer and who got drawn into all the information security stuff through privacy and other aspects of it. So it's been a fun ride. So, and thank you for inviting me to.
I'm Joanne Schwendinger. I'm Joanne Schwendinger, and I'm a lawyer at John Deere. I've been with John Deere for 16 years now, and until a year and a half ago, I did very little to touch data at all. And maybe there's a message in that. Maybe the message is that data really is important, and it takes all kinds. It takes all kinds, including people who are willing to think about it differently, think about it for the first times in their lives. I thought I was heading towards doing what I had done for the past 20 years, and here I am in a completely new practice area, finding it very interesting and energizing. And one of the messages that I hope to convey is the importance of taking a long view, because the reason I was asked to become the leader of our global practice group for information management, I was told, is that I have that ability to take the long view, to think about strategy as well as the day-to-day tactics of how we gather and use data. So I'm now the head of our global practice group for information management and loving every minute of it.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me here. You'll probably notice from the program, I am not Jeff Scherer. I am Martin Tully, Jeff's co-chair at the data law practice at the Chicago office of law firm Ackerman LLP. My background is I'm a 25+ year complex commercial litigator. So mostly what I've done throughout my career is try to help. In fact, I've had the pleasure of working in the past in my career for both Aon and with Deere. I try to do my best to make sure that they can sleep at night and look better in front of their CEOs and whatnot. That's what I do. So I work at a outside law firm. You're welcome. I work at an outside law firm, and about 12-ish years ago, realized that in the legal space, the emergence of technology, and particularly in the realm of electronic discovery and dealing with ESI in that context, was going to be a big deal. And managed to convince my somewhat initially skeptical partners that we ought to have a major presence at my then law firm to do this. And I finally convinced them, and my reward was, congratulations, you get to run it. But don't let it interfere with everything else you're doing. So I was the national practice chair of my former firm with respect to e-discovery. That very quickly also became information governance, because you can't have a good e-discovery program without a good information governance foundation. And about 2 years ago, left that firm to join Ackerman here in Chicago. And I co-chair along with the guy that we bait and switched you on, Jeff Scherer. We are co-chairs of our data law practice for the firm, which is a national firm. And data law in our practice covers 3 things: electronic discovery, information governance, and the hottest thing on the planet, data security and data privacy, which is what is now becoming a much, much bigger part of my practice. And I was told by Doug that we were supposed to be the Darth Vader panel, so I deliberately wore a suit and tie.
Well, myself, I'm Doug Kaminsky. I've worked for the last 21 years with companies on 4 continents, doing exactly this, kind of the application of everything we've been talking about. How do we manage data in a more mindful way? How do we ensure that sensitive data stays that way, but we also extract the value out of the data that we do have, because it is an asset. So all day you've been hearing all those wonderful things you can do. We're not the Department of No, or as Martin said, the Darth Vader panel. What we're trying to do is show you how you, have to be mindful of that, design your processes in that way, but also work with the legal side, the compliance side, to get to yes. Because there are a lot of challenges. I mean, data itself is very fluid. It exists in many places, in many forms. There's challenges because it spans boundaries. It's moving, but the amazing thing is, beyond the bits and bytes, there are people behind it. There's sensitive data in there, as well as there are laws governing how that data should travel. So that's kind of the first thing we're going to talk about is, Duke, some of the challenges you've had. In fact, all of you have kind of global practices. So what are some of the challenges you've had, some of the things we should consider when we're looking at, from a broader perspective, data and how we should be more mindful? Sure.
I think in my first 3 months at Aon, I had a huge wake-up call, and that is around the fact that technology now and what we can do with technology has so far surpassed what our legal frameworks are willing to allow us to do, that it kind of makes me sick a little bit sometimes, because there's so many things that we could do if the laws were a little bit looser. But one of the biggest challenges, Doug, that Aon has, and I suspect I'm not alone on this panel with this challenge, every time that we deploy a new system, a new environment, even doing something as simple as moving email from one environment, like an old Lotus Notes environment, to Outlook, all of that has to be done multiple times in multiple different locations. And we, in the first 3 months at Aon, moved to the Office 365 platform like 6.5 years ago. And we were all very excited because we were going to have one email environment globally, and it was going to be a huge win for Aon. And then we find that, wait, no, we can't do that because we have to have another instance in Germany. Oh, wait, no, actually, we also have to put another instance in Ireland. So what was going to be this wonderful single place for all of our email data became fragmented, in much the same way that our old system was. Still an improvement, but what I always have to do with the executives who are my primary stakeholders is really to temper their expectations of what success can be, without being the organization of no, because we always have to find a way to make it happen. But it's about setting the right expectation and understanding that there will be limits to what we can do with technology.
Great. So Joanne, you're at a product company. So
Yes.
Aon is mostly insurance. It's mostly, thought, whereas you're at a 180-year-old product company. How are things a little different for you, or how are they similar? And what are some of the challenges you faced, especially in your last year and a half, kind of being the data cop for Deere?
So John Deere is a product company. We do make agricultural equipment. We make tractors and combines, those big machines that you see in the field, as well as construction equipment. And one of the things that's been interesting is an internal challenge. We still largely think of ourselves, many of us still think of ourselves in those terms. And even within the organization, the 57,000 or so employees that we have, we don't realize how much we're doing with data. And we're doing a lot with data. So we're not one or the other. We are a yes and company. We're doing things with data. Of course, we all have employee data, so we have to be sure that we're doing things with employee data appropriately. We have 57,000 people around the world. We buy things from lots and lots of people. So we have lots of data about our vendors, of people who sell us things to make our tractors, to make our combines, and to make the desks and tables that we sit at. But we also have the data, we capture data about our customers, about themselves individually and as businesses, and we also capture data about how they are farming, for example, how they're running a construction work site. So the types of data are almost mind-boggling, and in the midst of all of that, we have values and ethics that reflect the fact that we're a 180-year-old products company, but we're also doing these amazing things with data. And how do we blend the two together in a way that's consistent with the law, but also true to ourselves, true to our own internal ethics and values?
Well, Jill, this is interesting because you're changing jobs, but you're going from one heavily regulated company to another. So let's talk about that, because some data actually is regulated. And some of you have heard about that in the healthcare industry, for example. Any of you have been to a doctor in the last X number of years, you've filled out a HIPAA consent form, right? I see a lot of heads shaking. So talk a bit about that, some of the challenges, because you've got some data that's regulated, some that is not.
Mm-hmm.
And then from a broader perspective, many in the audience are looking at how do we do the analytics side of that? Well, that has to be tempered because some data is regulated, some is not. What were some of your challenges there?
Sure, I can talk about that. If you don't mind, can I just ask the audience a question? How many of you are students, like full-time students? All right, how many of you are part-time students also and then working outside? All right, how many are full-time students and full-time work? Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of you doing that. That I totally get. And then how many are people from corporate who are not students here? Is anyone here? Okay, there are corporate. And how many of you are in IT? Okay, so it's a good combination. All right, last question. How many of you are in information security? Oh, look at that. Okay, great. And for us, at least for me, it helps me as I frame my answers to kind of know where you're coming from and where you are and how many people are in technology, how many people are not in technology. Doug, thank you for the question. Regulation, there are fewer and fewer industries nowadays that are not regulated, right? That regulation is increasing. And what we're finding is it started at the federal level, right? You have HIPAA, which Doug just mentioned, but now 48 states have data privacy laws. And in fact, some states have more than one privacy law. And each of them tell you how you're going to respond if you breach someone's privacy, and they define it. And definitions are different depending on states. And some states require encryption of data. Some require encryption in flight. Some require encryption at rest. Some require two-factor authentication. And the question is for most companies, because there are a lot of companies that have the company I came from was a 100-year-old company with a lot of legacy systems. And when you're looking at a lot of legacy systems, there are challenges, similar to what you're talking about with rolling out Office 365. There are a lot of challenges as to how do we comply with this regulation in the system that was never meant to have any sort of encryption or whatever tool or technology that's needed. So those are constant challenges that you have to look at with respect to regulation. The other is de-identification of data. I mean, it's looking at and understanding, you know, kind of as Joanna had talked about, what data do you have? How much data do you have? How much are you working with? And for me, as a CISO, the first thing I do in whatever company is focus on education and training, because in the end, information security is not about IT, it's not about technology, it's not about the Information Security Office, it's about every single individual who is touching our data out there, all of our employees. And the bottom line is our employees want to do the right thing, and a lot of times they just don't know what that is. And a lot of the mistakes that we see in this regulated data come from employees doing, I call it smart people doing silly things. Lots of smart people doing silly things because they don't know any better, because they don't understand, because they're not monitoring. And so it's how do we educate those folks? Just on the regulation side, so you understand, how many of you are familiar with the Anthem breach last year? Huge, massive hit. I don't remember the numbers. Yes, there were 57 separate state and federal investigations into Anthem because there were so many different regulations that Anthem fell under. So it is unbelievable how much this regulation is hitting, where it's hitting, and how it impacts all of us, which I believe is why you're seeing a lot more lawyers who are also in that information security space, because there's that unique combination of skills that tends to be necessary when you're looking at it.
You know, on that topic of lawyers doing this, you were asking questions. Are there any other lawyers in the room or people with a legal background?
All right.
One.
I was certain you were going to raise your hand.
So anecdotally, I was at the RSA conference a few weeks ago, and I went to the CISO forum, and it was a room about this size, maybe twice as many people in it, all CISOs, mainly at big companies and medium-sized companies. And one of the questions that they asked as they were kind of polling the audience was how many people came from a legal background. And I expected to be one of maybe 3 or 4 people raising my hand, but there was probably 20% of the people in that room had a legal background in some form or fashion. And I think that's very, very true, Jill. I think you're going to see a lot of people starting to migrate into the information security space as the legal pressures on big companies start to really impact how people have to manage their data.
Absolutely.
And if I could jump in with another observation on your comments, Jill, you talked about the number of states there are in the United States and the fact that there's also federal legislation that tells us what we should be doing with data and what we shouldn't be doing with data. But of course, countries around the world have their own perspective about what should be done with data. Some countries don't regulate this space at all. Some of them regulate it very highly. So if you're thinking about data in a global context, I talked before about how much data and how different the data is and the complexity that exists about data, what kinds of data. You add to that the complexity in the regulatory space, and it makes for some interesting conversations about what you should do, how you tie those streams together and braid them into a tapestry that's going to work for you.
Actually, that's a perfect segue, because I was going to, all these things combined lead me to Martin. Or Martin on the end. So Martin, give some examples, because you counsel clients all over the globe on exactly these types of things. These are the challenges. You're helping them set up systems, helping them do this more mindfully. So, you know, give some real world examples for the folks and some of your views on this.
Sure, thanks, Doug. And I think that actually Duke, Jill, and Joanne are being very, very polite when they try to paint this picture of the complexity and fluidity that exists right now with respect to the sea of regulations that right now affect in some way data. 48 states, not only are they different, but there's probably at least a dozen states right now that are introducing new legislation affecting privacy. So it is not a static environment at all. It's fluid, it's constantly changing. The federal government, depending on what you consider a data or information governance or privacy statute, there's anywhere between, depends who you talk to, 30 and 60 different federal laws that impact in some way the exchange of information. And then you have the international stage, which nobody knows what's going on there right now, because the And we had Safe Harbor, then Safe Harbor was thrown out, then we had the EU-US Data Privacy Shield, which of course coincided with the Captain America films, at least that's the way I looked at it. Then that got kicked to the curb. So right now we're really dealing with a lot of the clients that I represent are looking for some guidance of what do I do? The minute I think I have it figured out, suddenly everything changes. And it's that constant challenge of the law not keeping pace with the meteoric developments in technology and best practices. Everybody wants to have the next best thing with respect to data, and that's great, ingenuity, innovation. Everybody wants to have the next best product. But oftentimes things such as compliance, regulation, risk management, cost management are secondary thoughts. And that's where I come in quite a bit, is I'm not trying to tell people don't do this. I'm trying to figure out how can you do it in a constantly changing environment where what the rules are today could be very different tomorrow. And that's a challenge. So it does come back to what Doug said. To put it very simply, what I try to communicate is it's all about mindfully managing cost and risk. In all four of those words, you're going to find just about everything you need in this environment. Mindful means you have to, first of all, know what you're dealing with. And you'd be surprised how often with the growth, the speed, and the mobility and different forms that data takes in most organizations, I'm constantly dealing with clients who don't even know what they have. Don't know where it is, who's in charge of it, what its purpose, why do they have it, and it creates a lot of issues. Managing, it's all about managing cost and risk. And it used to be that storage was cheap, just dump it all somewhere in a server, we'll get something to hold more petabytes, everything will be fine. We're finding out that that is really sort of a false paradigm because there is cost to keeping too much information. Anyone here ever seen the show Hoarders? Come on, you can admit it. All right, we watch the show Hoarders, and you see people living in these environments you couldn't fathom you living in with respect to their belongings. And yet I see tons of organizations that are living the electronic version of Hoarders. Stuff that's all over the place. And forget about mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, data that's in multiple places. It just becomes even more difficult to deal with and oftentimes isn't dealt with. And then there's the managing the risk part of it. We touched a little bit upon security, but one thing I try to advocate to my clients is practice good information hygiene, because not only are you going to be, it's like diet and exercise, not only are you going to be a fitter organization if you practice good information hygiene, but you're also going to have less to lose, either from a hacktivist, a city-state who's trying to get trade secrets or intellectual property, or somebody mentioned the careless employees. It's the person that clicks on the spear phishing email. You can have the best firewall, you can have the best security, you can have double, triple authentication, encryption, which that even what encryption is at the state level is changing. There's not even agreement on that. But it's that one careless employee that clicks on the spear phishing email that thinks it says something from the CEO that gets behind your walls and suddenly you're doomed. And I also have to remind people one more thing. I still see, in fact, 6 months ago, I got a phone call from literally the cliche, I left the laptop in the back of the New York City taxi cab. Yeah. What? Was it encrypted? No. Password protected? I'm not sure. What was the password? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Or better yet, it was taped to the computer.
Yes. That still happens. That still happens. So these are the kind of things that we're seeing all the time and really trying to help clients mindfully manage the costs and risks associated with this area, which is moving like the speed of a bullet train.
So all great points. So that kind of begs the question, how do you manage these two pieces? So you talk to the privacy folks, and Martin is right. Companies have become data museums almost because they've gotten masses of this data.
Museums are better organized.
Yeah, that's true.
Curators there.
And most of the data they don't need. It has no business, legal, regulatory value. There is no need for it. However, we haven't broomed it because identifying what should be broomed, what shouldn't, is a very time-consuming cost effector. If you ask the folks in IT security, they say, keep it for as little time as possible. I was working with a pharmaceutical company and the CIO said, okay, I got a solution. Everything that's older than 60 days, we're just gonna delete. Now, 2 months later, he was indicted and there was a lot of issues. I understood why he wanted to delete it. Now, on the opposite side, the analytics folks say, no, we want you to keep everything as long as possible. We have a very rich data lake. We can get stuff out of it. But you're also keeping the junk, right? So how do we balance those priorities? How do we create an organization where we balance the needs of all the parties in such a way that we get to yes more commonly for the business? So as everyone here has said so far, we manage the risk, we manage the cost, and we're extracting more value out of the data. I'll just open it up.
Sure. So we have 5 different data analytics organizations within the Aon organization, and my team is sort of the holder of the keys to the castle, and they love data, and they love to replicate data. They don't want to deal with it within the environments that we have natively. They want to create their own data lake, more like a swamp generally. But we recently had a kind of a knockdown drag out about one of our business units wanting to take all of the email of all 75,000 employees of Aon and put it into an analytics engine in order to run essentially, enough data extraction activity against it to determine what communication behaviors within the email were leading to better client outcomes. So it's a cool idea, right? You have to have other points of reference in order to do that. But they wanted to not only take and replicate all of our data, they also wanted to keep it indefinitely. Which, of course, as a lawyer and from an e-discovery perspective, is sort of your worst nightmare, because you have no ability to represent to the court how long you have any piece of information. And we really like to be able to tell the court we don't have it anymore. So we finally got to a place, and our answer for this particular question, and what I think will likely be the case for a lot of these sort of scenarios in the future, is we have to have the ability, either technically or manually, to anonymize data and make it no longer regulated. To wave a magic wand across the pool and say, okay, this is no longer regulated data. It's hard to do that with email, especially if you're in a regulatory heavy country like any country in the EU. But it's possible, and we're investing in technology now to anonymize data in order to mine it for greater value.
Yeah. I keep forgetting I'm wired. So I agree with you. I think one of the keys is that de-identification. The issue is, again, it goes back to companies that have been around for a long time have been throwing data into all the same place. They're all in the same servers, they're all in the same files. So you have merger and acquisition data and PII, personal identifiable information, personal health information, sitting there with grandma's cookie recipe. And they're all together, and you don't know how to segregate them. And maybe you can talk to this a little later. The problem is when you go for cyber insurance, they go, how much PHI or PII do you have? How much sensitive data do you have? And your response is, I don't know, but this is all of our data, right? So there's a huge issue with respect to being able to understand where your data is located. Part of that goes back to the whole data classification process. It can be very difficult to classify data. But again, if you as an organization start and just say, on this date, we're going to start classifying, and all sensitive data is going to go to this place. And over the course of time, 3 to 5 years, you'll have segregated most, if not all, of your data. I mean, with respect to regulated industries, it's 7 to 10 years, depending on the state that we hold it, is how long we have to hold it. And then the question is, how do we dispose of it? Again, it's finding ways to, if you want to hold that data longer, then to how do you de-identify that data, anonymize that data, so it's no longer linked back to an individual. How many of you understand? Does anyone not understand the whole idea of de-identification or anonymization? Is that a new concept to anyone? Okay.
It's kind of like money laundering, but
this is a smart
information
group.
laundering.
I know it's a smart group. I just do. Suddenly start using 3 letters. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So I just want to talk a minute about the decision-making process, about what one does with data. And in an organization of any size, one of the dangers is that, especially if you're decentralized, you have a lot of smart people doing things in their own realms, and the decision-making is decentralized. You have 5 people making 5 different decisions about what they're going to do with data, what data they're going to collect, how they're going to collect it, how they're going to transmit it, how they're going to store it. And then at some point you realize, oh my God, we're all over the place. We're doing everything. Is this sustainable? And if it's looking like it's not sustainable, what I suggest is that you take a time out and you get those 5 people into a room and you talk about fundamental questions like, what is the overall strategy? Where are we going in this organization? What is our 5-year or 10-year plan? And what specifically our 5-10-year plan with regard to data? What's the strategy? And if the 5 different people who have been doing 5 different things can agree that there's a single strategy, then you start to have a place that you can have a conversation about what your guiding principle should be. What guiding principle should we apply, all 5 of us apply, with regard to data? Should we have different definitions for the same kind of data? If we're talking about water data, do I get to define it or does Jill get to define it? Get the people around the table to agree that there needs to be a single definition. So this is where I think a lot of the exciting, I know at DEER, there's a lot of exciting work right now with getting those people together and finding a way to put a stake in the ground and say, this is what we want to be known for. This is what we're going to do. There's a single strategy. We're going to come up with data governance principles and then make rules and processes that flow from those that are consistent, that ultimately should untangle some of those threads that we're still trying to bring together.
Absolutely.
I'll add 2 things. One is a reason for hope, and the other one is a reason for still further concern. Hope always starts first. Technology is actually, as much as the challenges it presents, it also presents opportunities. And in the legal space, there are advanced analytical tools that hold out the promise of helping with this auto-classification within an environment. And some of this comes from tools that we used as litigators for electronic discovery when we were dealing with massive amounts of information that wasn't particularly well organized, and we had to figure out what was responsive to a request or a government investigation or a subpoena. And as that technology has improved, we're finding new applications for it in a non-litigation context. For example, in the divestiture context, when a company splits off into 2 different companies, there's his data, her data, and our data. And how do you figure that out? And in a way that you can do it so that people don't end up with more than what they should, or for not longer than they should. Some of the advanced analytical tools that exist have been showing some promise of helping do that, consistent with working with a legal team and with a client. And I've been asked to work with some clients on doing just this very thing. It also comes up in the due diligence context for an acquisition, for example, or an audit where someone wants to acquire a company. It's now very much on the forefront, not just what is the financial health of this organization, but what are their security risks? What am I buying here? Am I going to buy something that they've been experiencing breaches for the last year and it just hasn't been reported? The SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, then there's America's Privacy Cop, the Federal Trade Commission, are really flexing their muscles in this space for organizations that aren't demonstrating adequate security. So in the acquisition context, you're seeing more the acquiring company wanting to do an audit of what they're getting. Where is the PHI? Where is the PII? What is going on here? And how do I protect our own intellectual property and our own trade secrets? Because that's what a lot of the state actors are looking for. Certain countries will remain nameless. They don't want my driver's license. They're not going to fill out a tax return for me. What they want to know is, what is John Deere's next acquisition? Or what is John Deere's next design for the flying tractor? That's what they want to get their hands on. So there's some hope there in that some of the technology that's out there is showing promise to be used in that sense to help us actually tackle some of these problems. All right, here's the concern. How many people in this room?
Wait, I'm sorry, that was hopeful.
Yeah, that was hopeful. This is Darth Vader fan. How many people? Well, the flying tractor, that's hopeful. How many people in this room work with other people's data? When you get a company or an organization that has finally figured out maybe how to deal with their own environment, their vendors, the people in the supply chain become a huge risk. Now, I'm a member of a law firm, and I'm sure some of you have heard about this thing called the Panama Papers. It's been in the news lately. The folks that want to get your information have figured out that maybe John Deere and Ann have, they're the fortress of solitude and no one can penetrate them. But Ann works with a lot of vendors. John Deere works with vendors, auditors, accounting firms, law firms, and they've been targeted as the soft underbelly. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been putting out reports for years saying that these are the targets. And oftentimes some of these organizations are keeping your data longer than they should. We don't do that. But you also have to not only look at your own environment, you have to look at who are you outsourcing your information with, and are their security protocols, is their mindfulness up to par with yours?
Yeah, and 20% of my team, we have a 300-member security organization globally, and 20% of them are all about third-party assessment. So if you look at that number, it's like, that's a lot of people at Aon just looking out for the security of the stuff we don't manage ourselves. So it's a good career path in that regard.
And I guess I would add that in most companies, you don't have 300 people looking out, and the vendors go two ways. One is the people who are your subcontractors, who are supporting you with whatever work they're supporting you, who have access to your client data. And so it's assessing everything that they're doing. But then the other question is when your clients come in and ask you, how are you protecting your data? And how are your vendors protecting the data? So you have to kind of look at it both ways, because it's never just let's go look at what our vendors are doing. It's what are our clients asking about what our vendors, what our third-party contracts are doing.
I'll give you another real-world example. We try to pepper as many of those in as we can. How many of you have heard of the Sony breach? Probably only a few. Okay. There's a number of things that the Sony breach kind of brought to light, and let's face it, the sexy part of it was the stealing of the intellectual property in the movies, right? And then after that, it was all the nasty things the executives were saying in the emails. But what people really didn't focus on, the damage was normally done by about 2,000 documents. So Jill and Duke and Joanne were talking about how do you classify documents as we went through. This was data that was actually very sensitive in secured systems, was pulled out for reporting purposes and dumped into PDFs and spreadsheets and Word documents. It's about 2,000 documents, but it contained the sensitive information. It was rates of pay, it was the personal information for the employees. And all that information, had there been a protocol, and as Jill and others have said, we teach our people about the data. That data should have been destroyed after a period of time, after it left the secured system. It should have been password protected and encrypted, and it wasn't. Less commonly known is another company, Deloitte, was dragged into that because humans do things, right? We've got flash drives, you get flash drives here and there, right? A woman that was in HR at Deloitte brought her HR files with her from Deloitte that had templates, things for hiring and all kinds of helpful things, plugged her USB drive in, uploaded it to the departmental server, and now I think it was about 38,000 Deloitte employee records were now on the Sony shared drives, which was then grabbed when the hackers grabbed the 100 terabytes and kicked down the door. It's lesser known, but you can Google it. It's just put in, Sony breach Deloitte, and it'll tell you all about it. But that illustrates all the things we've been talking about, which is if we teach folks how to mindfully deal with data, if we classify it better so we don't have big swamps and lakes of data, and we're not exposing that soft underbelly, then if and when, because it's usually when, we do have an incident, there's going to be less damage, there's going to be less harm. So now let's kind of focus and talk about how do we create that culture? What have you been finding works? What are things that can make a difference as you go out into the world? I'm sure some of you now want to go to the privacy side. Forget that analytics stuff. You're coming to the dark side now, and whether the privacy side. But even if you aren't, you have to be mindful of that. So how do we take some things away that will help, really the folks in the room do that in their organization?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's getting harder. Like driving better behaviors, especially as the generational change is occurring in front of us with a lot of millennials entering the workforce. I mean, we live in a pretty amazing time. The Internet of Things, I can walk into my house and tell Siri to turn my lights on, or what's the weather, that kind of thing. It's a cool world we're living in, and we are now becoming very accustomed to sharing a lot of data quite freely. On my Facebook, I'll document my entire life, but I still have an expectation of privacy in other parts of my life. And driving those behaviors and driving that cultural change within a workforce is a challenge, because we have employees who are very willing to share large amounts of their own information online. That definition of privacy is really changing. But when we ask them to better protect Aon's information and to be very mindful of and thoughtful about what they're doing, how they're doing it, that you're hitting a paradigm kind of conundrum there, because people live their personal lives in a very open way now. So I think there is a cultural change. I think what you have to do is make compliance very easy. Data classification, I think, is a great example of something that won't happen unless you make it part of the process. So we're in the process now of implementing a tool that if we create a PDF or we create a Word document or PowerPoint, you can't save that document unless you classify it. And then that engine that runs that data classification process is smart enough to learn and say, okay, I'm going to index that file. You tell me that is a finance document. I'm going to then run that algorithm, that machine learning across your entire database or your entire unstructured file repository, and auto-classify against the decisions that were made that I've learned from. So we have that option now, but you have to make it part of the process. It has to be essentially required to move forward. Because otherwise, I don't want to be a buzzkill, but otherwise it won't happen otherwise.
So I think a couple different things. I put down here, thanks for that. How do we make this pragmatic for you? So how do you walk out of here not saying, oh, that was a good panel, what am I going to do now? To actually, what can I do now? And my first point is ask questions. Ask questions of your security people. Ask questions as you're developing whatever you're developing as a developer. Are you using SDLC? Are you using SSDLC, which is the Secure System Development Lifecycle? As you're doing data analysis, where's that data coming from? How are you integrating security into that analysis? Are you asking those questions? And those are really important things. When I talk to lawyers, I always tell them, go sit down with your information security person and ask them questions. Information security is not rocket science. Everyone in this room is smart enough to start asking questions. If your people cannot answer them, it's because they're not explaining it well. Keep asking them. They should be able to explain to you what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it. Again, I think all of those points, bottom line for me, it's a company reputational risk, right? Because we may remember Angelina Jolie from Sony, but you remember Sony. And the millennials, which is really interesting, a lot of them are like, I'm not going to use PlayStation anymore because PlayStation's been hacked X number of times. We've had that. So it really is your company's reputation. And again, I mean, it's always we have to be right 100% of the time. They only have to be right once to get through, to get into our networks, to get that data. And then your reputation is shot. Target is still reeling. Home Depot is still reeling. I personally won't shop at Home Depot. From these reputational risks, and if you're not a large business that can quickly survive and move on, and you're a smaller business, there's a likelihood you won't survive, especially if you're a law firm, those types. But with respect to driving the culture, our education campaigns that we've put together are all about our employees and their families. So everything that we've done, November, we always put out something, shopping online. What do you do? How do you protect your family? You know, kids, how are you protecting your kids online? So we do monthly blogs. I do a monthly blog, and it's always about something related to not only how are you protecting yourself, how are you protecting the company data, but how are you protecting your kids? How are you protecting their data? And what we found, in fact, my last day, literally my last day in the office, a woman came up to me and said, yeah, my son, who was probably not even a teenager, wanted to put a keyboard app on his computer. And I looked at him and I said, did you read the privacy policy? What other information is it collecting from you? And he went, and then his younger sister wanted to put one on, and the brother said to the sister, well, you need to look at that privacy policy because they're putting on, so it's that information, because when you can integrate it into their personal lives is when it will also integrate back into your business. And so it is finding that link, because now, especially with the millennials, there is no segregation for most people anymore between their business life and their personal life, right? We're on 24/7. And so I may take off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to go hang out with my son because he has some hockey event, but I'm gonna be back online at 7 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night. And I think that's how we are running now, at least within the United States, as people working in the industry. So it's always thinking about how do we change what it is that we're pushing out there, what our message is, so that it hits the people who we wanna receive.
I totally agree that at the individual level, people need to be mindful and aware and care about security, their own and the security of others. I also agree that we should automate whatever we can. We should make it easy for people to do security, to do privacy. But I also think it's important to focus at the other end of the corporate spectrum, the environment in which I work. The board has to care about this, the CEO has to care about this, the C-suite has to care about this, and that they are critical in building a culture of security.
Just to pick up on that, I couldn't agree more with what Joanne just said. It has to be mission critical within the organization. Long gone are the days where security or information governance was an IT issue or a legal issue. It's a company issue, and it does have to start and end in the C-suite. There's no question about it. And I want to also pick up on what Jill said in terms of asking questions, because that really goes to understanding your environment. What is, for example, what's your risk profile? What's your risk tolerance? Not every company is the same. Every organization is the same. You really have to understand what it is that your risk tolerance is, and what risk can you accept, what risk can you avoid, what risk can you shift into others. Cybersecurity, cyber insurance is becoming a bigger player in this space right now. And how much can you accept? And trying to cordon things off into those different buckets within your organization. But that takes a conversation that involves asking a lot of questions. Within an organization, it's really about changing the workplace culture. And for years, we've done this with respect to employee relations, and there were things that happened in the 60s that are unheard of today because we've changed the culture within organizations. Well, this is the same thing. Someone said that data is the new oil, and its value is tremendous, and we need to treat it in a way that the company, everyone at every level, takes it very seriously. And that means changing the corporate culture, that means training, that means having outside audits done in your organization, that means having your own spear phishing exercise to see who in the company clicks on it, things like that. And then last but not least, the one thing we can't forget is no matter what we do, there will be something that happens.
Yeah.
Right? Something will happen. And then it's all about having a good incident response plan in place that is tailored to your organization for how you're going to deal with it. Don't think about that for the first time when the proverbial you don't know what is hitting the fan. Have a plan in place, know who's going to deal with it, both internally and externally, so that you can minimize those reputational harms and other damages that occur to the kind of companies that Jill was talking about.
All excellent points. So in roughly 10 minutes, you're going to be going from here to the art gallery downstairs, which is where you're going to find the hors d'oeuvres, and you're going to find the alcohol. But before that time, we have that time, about 10 minutes, to ask these wonderful panelists whatever question that you'd like regarding what we've just been talking about. Yes? Would you to bring a mic to that? Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for the discussion. It's been very insightful. My question is directed to Joanne. My name is Rahul. I work for Cummins. So the question is sort of in the automotive industry. With the advent of the Internet of Things and telematics data and all of that, we have engines sending us information. We sell that to OEMs who have information being sent to sell it to fleets and owners. And there's a whole conversation about data ownership, who owns that data, and if we can find driver profile behaviors or things like that. It's not very clear as to what the data ownership is, what we can do with the models, what we cannot do. From a legal perspective, what's your take on this? Is there some governance that we have established, or how does John Deere maybe deal with this sort of aspect?
That's a great question, a very insightful one, and I think in the way you almost answered the question for yourself. I like to try to avoid the question of data ownership because I think it's almost a red herring. I think in terms of rights to data, rights to access it, rights to use it, rights to sell it, rights to do whatever it is that we're talking about. So rights to data rather than ownership of data. And in our conversations at John Deere, people still do talk about ownership, and one of my jobs is to push us to think towards rights with regard to the data. And when you parse it out that way, then you think more in terms of yes, no, toggle switches. Did it come from you? Did you have the right to give it to me? If I'm going to do something with it, do you have the right to say yes or no? And then can you pass that on to me? I think that starts to make it more possible to put it into a binary context that you can actually program for.
Who makes the decision? Around, I mean, I'm thinking about how I would integrate that and.
Actually, I can add to that. I just
Yeah.
finished an engagement with an auto manufacturer. And we specifically were creating a telematics data governance plan for them that they had to submit to the FTC and the National Traffic Safety Board and a few other government entities. Because prior to them allowing to let these Wi-Fi enabled cars out, they needed to be able to show, here's how we're taking the data, here's how we're managing it, here's how we're anonymizing it, if we are indeed going to sell it to other parties to be able to access some of the very useful data from it. So there are more and more groups looking at it. If you haven't been contacted by them, you've been flying under the radar.
Well, and contracts are pretty wonderful things when you
Yes.
actually form a business relationship with someone else. You can put on paper who wants it. And I'll tell you, despite the fact that it's that easy, our lawyers miss it all the time. And you know, we are a company that buys a lot of companies, and we sell parts of ourselves from time to time. And it's shocking to me how often I see a divestiture agreement that does not have a clause about data ownership of the divested company. And then that's when my job and my team's job gets so much harder. So my answer would be contracts, actually.
Contracts and consent. And Jill, to go back to your question, you can only deal with the person you're doing business with. You have the proximate relationship to your customer, whoever that person is. Sometimes we go beyond that and ask that person, what about the person behind you? And tell me, yes, you have the right to take that and do what we're proposing to do with that as well.
You have the mic, sir?
So in regards to regulatory complexity that's currently out there, what steps can public institutions take to protect individual privacy, but reduce or at least minimize burden on private industry?
Minimize burden on private industry. You have to explain your question a little bit.
You all talked about the challenges right now for especially large companies operating internationally and across state borders with the complexity of regulations and how definitions vary and how degree of regulatory vary across states and international borders. What steps can governments take to still protect individual privacy, but minimize to the highest degree possible the legal burden placed on businesses that are working with large amounts of data?
I think one of the things we try to do is have a fairly high level of compliance expectations for everybody, regardless of which 500 offices you're in. So it's true that in Germany, we have a very high expectation of data privacy, and we apply essentially that same level of data privacy to the rest of the organization because it just makes doing business with another country easier. So it's kind of rotten that you have to apply the highest standard to everybody, but at the end of the day, it's almost easier from a business process perspective.
And for me, I mean, when I look at the different models, you have ISO, you have NIST, you have COBIT, you have all these different models that you can use. Every organization, all the regulatory organizations are leveraging different ones. HHS, Health and Human Services, for example, said, no, we're not going to tell you. So if you come and tell us that you're following NIST and you're tracking with this, or you're ISO compliant, or you have SOC 2 attestation, you're going to say, no, it doesn't necessarily mean that you pass the HIPAA security rule. What I would propose, and it will never go through, is we need a common standard across the US. That we need, I know there's been a lot of, yeah. Globally would be even better if we could ever get there.
That you realize you're getting
Highly
everyone
political.
unemployed
Yeah, right.
here.
But
I'm
a common,
loving it.
yeah, but a common standard across the US, because as someone who works in the industry, I'm always having to monitor and change what I am doing and what my company is doing. so that it can respond to the latest and greatest of whatever comes out of regulation. And yeah, regulation is two things. One, totally behind the times, and two, then when they come out, most of the times the people writing the regulations have no background in this area. They don't understand what they're writing. They put in words with no context as to the implications to business. So really looking at how do we bring all of that together to create something that's really powerful for, at least for me, for the United States, and then move it globally.
These really are some of the people that should be helping write regulations. Unfortunately, they're not.
And when was the Federal Trade Act written? The Federal
Oh,
Trade Act
wow.
governs
Oh,
the
yeah.
the Federal
The
Trade
50s.
Commission, the
Yeah.
primary
Yes.
US regulator. That statute was written in,
I think 40s and 50s,
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
at least the core.
Somebody wrote with a handlebar mustache.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for being here, just to start, but you've all mentioned that without much direction by way of documented law, it's mission critical for organizations to at least try and develop guidelines to classify their data. So my question really has two parts. In the absence of concrete regulation, a lot of times players within industries come together to form best practices. So where is that effort? Can you guys describe kind of how far we've come in that respect? And also, on the legal front, what's the status of the action plan for regulators? I mean, where are they in making all of
Which
this?
regulators?
Whatever the FTC says.
No, it depends.
I feel like you could say this about a lot of law, but where are we in just making this more simple? Is there an action plan to make this law more simple? The laws of how, or the regulations of how you classify data.
I think the answer to that is a simple no. I'm not aware of any action plan to simplify in the United States. In fact, it's going in the other direction.
There's legislation that's been kicked around at the national level, but none of it's really gained much traction. There's a lot of talk about the need for that uniform national standard, but maybe
Well,
we'll
and to
get
be
that
honest-
when we get a budget in the state of
Be
Illinois.
really-
The-
Exactly.
The legislative affairs groups, probably of all of our companies, and I'm really good friends with the head of our legislative affairs group, we would probably lobby against it, to be
Yeah,
honest with you.
Our insurance company.
Because
definitely.
we want them as professionals, but the more complexity and the more standards you have to apply nationally, internationally, it's just more work.
So I think I would be remiss if I did not talk for 10 seconds about the NIST framework. So this is a cybersecurity framework that was put together with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It was both the public sector and the private sector that put this together. It came out of an executive order 2013 to move to 2014. It really is a solid framework for how you establish an information security program. It talks about and addresses pretty much all of the issues that we've talked about here, from everything from detection and prevention to response. And what I've found is that as you move towards that framework, or your company moves towards that framework, and you set up that the regulators that we are working with, many of them are being trained on this. I know the insurance regulators are being trained on the NIST framework, so that as things to look for. So it is a framework that is slowly beginning to be accepted as a common standard for the United States. It is not an international standard though, so it's very CONUS-based, it's very US-based.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here. Also want to thank our panelists, Duke, Jill, Joanne, Martin.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. I hope you all learned some things about how to think about data, and not just the analytic sense, and maybe we've moved some of you to the dark side. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.